It was a time of uprising, protest, and seismic political change, a 12-year period that shook and shaped Washington to its core. A fascinating museum exhibition turns back the clock. Washington Full Circle starts right now. Welcome to Washington Full Circle. I'm Furman Patterson. Looking around this city today, it's hard even for a D.C. native like me to imagine the kind of dramatic political, social, and cultural change that occurred here from 1963 to 1975. So radical were the changes during those 12 years that it shook and shaped Washington. It's all documented in a fascinating exhibit at the Anacostia Community Museum. Sharon Rankin is the museum's deputy director, and Marjorie Lightman is co-curator for the exhibit. Thanks to you both for stopping by to tell us all about it. Now, the first thing I want to know, what was the catalyst for this specific exhibit at the museum? Well,
the museum is really focused on looking at the urban community and change, and this is a really important period in the history of this city. It actually looks at what happened between 63 and 75, and really is a precursor to many of the changes going on in the city today. So it's really part of our mission to really document and develop educational programs around the urban city, and particularly in Washington, D.C.
For those who aren't familiar with this Smithsonian Museum, tell us exactly where it is.
The Anacostia Community Museum is located in the Fort Stanton community of Washington, D.C. We have been in Southeast Washington since our founding during this period in 1967. And we have had a continuous program of exhibitions and educational programs. We present about 160 educational programs a year. We do a ton of documentation, very much focused on community documentation and community engagement.
Now, for a 12-year period that shook and shaped Washington, that's an awful lot of research that went into it. We're talking a 12-year period. Tell us, how daunting was that?
Very daunting. It was, how do you take the simultaneity of all of this and somehow or other make it comprehensible so you can experience it sequentially as you go through the exhibit and understand that it's all happening at the same time.
Now, it's a multimedia exhibit?
It is indeed.
Tell us what that entails.
It entails, you'll hear John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address. You'll see a television set with a program on the Southwest, exactly the kinds of television sets that were in every home during this period. And then there are iPads with stories of people who lived through this, people who were part of these events.
So, Sharon, you were seeing people walk through that, some people that probably lived through that period. What do the visitors say about the exhibit?
Well, if you're a Washingtonian and you were in Washington, D.C. between 65 and a young person and active, you were a part of this, because we're all a part of that story. Everybody was active and working in the period, so they were either part of looking at what's happening in their community and looking at change and being a part of that. They were developing culture institutions. So the exhibition really shows the history of the development of all these parts of the city. Also, the rise of black leadership was at the same time. So anybody who's been a part of all those experiences understand the period and really participate in it. As Marjorie said, we have many stories from people who, in the exhibition, who are part of the period, who developed institutions and were part of the rise of leadership, of the rise of the Latino community, the rise of the gay community. So all of these stories are encompassed in the exhibition, and it really is a story of the people, about the people.
It's very interesting when you stand back and you see people moving through the exhibition, and they'll say, "Oh, I remember," because, you know, life goes on and there are many things that happen over decades, and you have to come to a moment and look back and say, yes, I was on the streets then.
Right. And there was a lot of things that happened, both culturally, politically, but especially politically. A lot of people don't realize that at one time Washingtonians couldn't vote for president.
That's right.
Is that covered there?
Yes, it is indeed. It certainly is. The first presidential election had people out on the streets. There are wonderful old photographs of registering for the first time,
wow,
able to vote.
And people on some of our channels watch the D.C. Council hearings, but that was something that was new, home rule and what that entailed. Tell us about that.
Well, that period established the first city council, the first Board of Education. The ANCs were established in that period, and the exhibition ends actually with a photograph of all the first members of the city council, all activists, all very much involved in the city, a tremendous group of people.
It's really interesting because Washington had no city politics. Unlike other cities in the country where ethnic immigrant groups, racial immigrant groups, all had the power to vote and therefore were of interest to local politicians. Washingtonians had no vote, so nobody was interested in organizing them.
That's hard to imagine.
That's right. So there are no street politics before this period.
Wow. And the other thing, too, is there were also protests here in the city, political protests. I think it's the Poor People's March, things like that. Is that covered as well?
Right. We actually focused on the Poor People's March. We actually obviously focused on the riots in '68 and other political protests. But it was a time of, as Marjorie says, taking to the streets, active protests. And Washingtonians were part of that, and Washingtonians were formational, a lot of that. As a matter of fact, staff at our museum were actually involved in the Poor People's March, actually putting together exhibitions at the Poor People's March.
Fantastic.
And you have to remember that Washington is both a city with people engaged in it, and it's also the stage. It's the national stage. So anybody who wanted to make a protest that was important wanted to make it in Washington.
Wow, so much more to talk about. We'll be right back with more on the politics, the movement, and even the music of the 12 years that shook and shaped Washington when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back to Washington Full Circle. The Anacostia Community Museum has managed to recapture a dramatic 12-year period in D.C. history when social, political, and cultural change all collided. Joining us now is Don Murray, a longtime D.C. resident who is featured on the exhibit. Now, first of all, you're no stranger to community events. You're a community organizer at one time, weren't you?
Right. I started out, I'm a longtime Washington resident now, but I'm actually originally from Baltimore.
We're claiming you now.
Right. And I've been over here now about 42 years. I started out as actually an organizer with the United Planning Organization on 14th Street. And then I became the deputy director for Friendship House on Capitol Hill. So I actually saw the city change in two areas. One was the original 14th Street area, which was really the activist center for the Black Power movement, for, I would say political. It was where they actually, Marionberry and Pride, Pride Incorporated, many of the people that I met were, in many ways, this exhibit is like a personal journey. I actually came to Washington in 1967 after coming out of Vietnam. And for me, Howard University became, and as crazy as it was, it became a place of respite because I was a veteran in combat, and it forced me actually to begin to think about, you know, what I want to do in my life. And so social work became the vehicle by which I did it. And that's how I really began to get into the city and meet some of its people.
Now, Marjorie, even with the Vietnam War, there were protests that occurred, anti-war protests. Tell us about that. Is that in the exhibit as well?
Oh, it certainly is. And the relationship of the police and the protesters. And, you know, today we talk about the dichotomy in society. Well, that was a moment where there was an enormous dichotomy if you were for the war or against the war. And the black community in Washington was largely against the war. It wasn't that there weren't other voices, but there was largely against the war. And the black journalists were concerned that black members of the community were being used as Hessians, as mercenaries in a white war, and they could be quite virulent. We have some texts in the that we used for the basis of what we say about it in the exhibit that reveal the degree of passion that was prevalent among all sorts of people for all sorts of ideological positions during this period.
You talk about passion. There, in some states, there was actually violence in some of the marches.
Oh, there certainly was.
Yeah.
Kent State.
Kent State, yeah.
Remember, they killed the students. It was a turning point. And when I was a graduate student at that point, I was up at Rutgers, and I was a graduate student, and we were told to stay on campus, that we couldn't be protected if we left campus because our politics were not the politics of the surrounding community.
Interesting.
I think there was a push-pull. I mean, in many ways, I really did not want to go, but I came from a background where my uncles and my father had been military people. And so the idea of service was something that was actually ingrained in the community I grew up in. And so I tell the story when I came back from Vietnam. It took me about 18 years to go down to the Vietnam War Memorial. Really? And part of it was because of the experience I had, but part of it was also the fact that I think there was mixed emotions, because in some ways the military was a beginning vehicle for blacks, in the sense that, you know, this is a chance to fight for your country. And I think that, so I think there was a real push-pull in the black community for those who were actually opposed to the whole peace movement, and those who in some ways saw it as a way to become a part of the total, you know, American environment. And so for me, it was, I really didn't tell most people when I was a student at Howard that I was a Vietnam veteran. I mean, I pretty much kept it to myself. And that was a combination of not really having a lot of care from the military when I got out, and part of it was just for self-protection. I mean, there was a lot of demonstrations going on at Howard, and I just felt I didn't want to, I just fought the war, right, and I didn't want to get into a fight on the campus around my viewpoint. And I just sort of kept it to myself, and it took me a long time before I actually came to grips with that experience. And I just hope that, for me, I think it was a tie-in with the energy that was at Howard, and the energy in the larger community, and that's where I saw the context of the peace movement, the whole Black Power movement. I think it was a social change environment, and I just found Washington exciting. I mean, in the sense that it gave me an opportunity to get into areas where I normally would not had even thought about it. First time I actually went to a college where most of the students from around the world. Howard had people from Africa, from Jamaica, from countries in Europe, and so the dialogue increased. And I think that when I looked at the exhibit, when I came through the exhibit, it was like going through signposts in my life. I mean, I remember going to the Drum and Spirit bookstore and met Tony Giddings. I remember when I worked at Friendship House, actually meeting Tapa Carew. My daughter's actually, one of the exhibits they have in there is the Jones Haywood Ballet School. My daughter's actually went to the Jones Haywood Ballet School. And so for me, as I went through the exhibit, and I think this is what I would say for people who haven't seen it, it becomes like a touchstone in terms of many parts of your life. And even the activism. I mean, I started out as a community organizer. I ended up, and this is a funny story, I ended up, when I was at Friendship House, actually teaching at then Federal City College.
Federal City College,
which was the homeless.
Hold on to that thought. We want to hear more from you, but we got to take a short break. Sure. More on the historic 12 years that shook and shaped Washington when we return. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're talking about a period in Washington history when social, political, and cultural change all collided to reshape the city. Now, Marjorie, tell us, how difficult is it to tell a story that's compelling enough in a museum about a turbulent period in history?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult under any circumstances, and it's very difficult for a period when a city was going through change in every single part of the human experience. The museum is very good at capturing stories. It's really quite astonishing, as a matter of fact. And its ability to take an exhibition and tie it to the individual story is one of its enormous strengths, so that each person's experience is both interactive with the larger story and individual enough to be unique. It really is a community museum, and is the only one in the Smithsonian that is a community museum. And when you talk about, I see parts of my life there, that's the best thing you can say, because if you go through it, maybe you'll see your older brother's life, or you'll look at the clothes and say, gee, I remember pictures in family albums with people wearing those clothes.
Right.
And this was a period where people not only dressed differently, but they cared so intently about what was happening around them that they were on the streets, that around family dinner tables there were intense discussions. In my household, it was boys with long hair. My father simply didn't think men should have long hair. And in other houses, it was an afro.
In my house, it was an afro. I mean, I think that the example I always use is my parents. I always gave them a choice. I said, do you want me to have an afro, or do you want me to get a processed head? And so, I mean, one of the things I think for me, it was generational. My parents had a certain perception. They had grown up pretty much as integrationists, and so my dad and I argued all the time about Black Power and all that kind of stuff. And I think that when I look back on it, I've had sort of the same discussion with my kids around hip hop and dreadlocks, and and I think what you see is what I would say for people is the exhibit is really it's a look forward and back, because some of the issues, like when I think about the whole question of the Marionberry and the whole pilot police precinct, I actually remember them and doing it, and they actually have a film of that in the exhibit where you actually, this is way before the whole police controversy now, that they actually show the relationship between how the community really tried to get a better working relationship with the police, and that's actually in the exhibit. And I think I didn't even realize I was in the exhibit. They actually have a voice as part of the exhibit. So I think that for me, working at Friendship House, I saw Roberta Flack. Friendship House was right around the corner from Mr. Henry's. And I remember when she was a school teacher at one of the schools in Washington, D.C. So a lot of my music was really geared through Roberta Flack. She's one of the first persons I really took an interest in, because it was a live performance, and she performed every Friday and Saturday. So I guess what I would say to people is that for me, there were between the pictures, the music, the stories, I just think it's something that I would encourage families to go see. I think it's a process where I hope they're engaging school children at all levels, because I think it has something for all communities, Latinos, gay, begin to see some of the new voices that came in Washington.
Let's stay on the music. There's music throughout, I understand. One of my colleagues visited the museum and said the music took her back. What type of music are we hearing at the exhibit?
You're hearing everything from Chuck Brown onward. The guitar is there, one of Chuck Brown's guitars, and Roberta Flack is there. And then there's one wall that is a pistache of all of the record covers from the pop singers of the period. And people stand in front of it and they say, oh, I remember when I heard that.
And that was back during the period when there were vinyl record 45s and albums instead of electronic music. So also, aside from the music, there are clothing. Where do you get this stuff from?
Oh, it's available. It's really not that hidden. I mean, it's in the back of many closets. So you just moved from a 5-bedroom house. I'm sure in the back of that 5-bedroom house closet was some dresses your wife had from the 70s.
Oh, yeah. And platform shoes.
Now, what do you think, the title of the exhibit, 12 Years that Shook and Shaped Washington, what do you think, what are some of the things that shook Washington when you think of that word?
Well, do you mean physically shake? They dug for the Metro.
Ah.
These are the years when the debate over the Metro, who would the Metro serve? And how would it reshape the city? If you came to Washington, if you went downtown in the early 70s, there were day after day when there was alerts on the air because there was no, the cars were all lined up, the buses were all lined up. You couldn't breathe and you couldn't move. We forget what Washington was like then. We rarely have high alert days anymore, although you can see on the bottom of the TV screens, it always gives you what's the atmosphere today.
Amazing.
And so the Metro is shook and shaped Washington like this.
And the politics. Yeah. I think that, I mean, one of the things that interested me, I was fascinated that you begin to see, when I first came to Washington, the district building was basically a white building, and you began to see the whole change. I remember attending a debate with Marion Barry, Sterling Tucker, and Walter Washington. And what struck me, I remember writing my dad a letter, basically indicating that even though they were all different, I was a Marion Barry guy because I was a. But I think that it was just a tremendous. I had a feeling that, you know, you could, it's almost like, I think with young kids who seen Barack Obama for 8 years. I had a feeling that I could do this. And I ended up actually started out as an advocate, ended up going working for district government, started out as a 12, eventually became a director of an agency, and I think what I saw was the possibilities. I saw black women and men.
There you go. And another reason to see this exhibit. Don't miss it. I think everyone should go to see it. Thanks to you both for joining us today. That's it for Washington Full Circle. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for watching. We'll see you again next time.